you who might have difficulty understanding English, Dr. Vitaly Perekrestov will translate in the aisle right row behind. You can, if you can't understand any English, we want to avoid repeating everything twice today. In the Church abroad, before the canonization of the royal family, the day of their martyrdom was a day of mourning for the Church, where a strict fast was instituted with panichidas for the repose. And in some ways, although today is a celebration of sorts, it's also a mournful day in that the Romanov family has now disappeared among the ruling houses of the world. For us in the 21st century, it's sometimes incomprehensible and ununderstandable what the significance is of a monarchy, especially an Orthodox monarchy. In some ways, we think that we have become much wiser than our ancestors. We're more enlightened. But in fact, what has happened is we've become more corrupt. We're not quite as wise as we think we are. And we're also become possessed by a very worldly spirit that darkens our perception of the reality of things around us. And that said, we sometimes miss what it means to be a ruler. Even among the ancient Romans, the emperors, for some reason it's more interesting to discuss their faults and their vices. It makes for better reading and more interesting conversation, as if they did nothing but have endless parties and perform all kinds of cruelties on the people subjected to them. But if we were to look deeper into the daily schedule of any one of these pagans, if we tried even for one day to fulfill the duties of an emperor, it would end up in a complete physical and nervous collapse for any one of us. Is to say nothing if we would visit the diaries and the stories told about the daily life and the duties of the emperors and the czars of Russia, Alexander III, Nicholas I, etc. I'm not here to discuss in detail. It would take much too long for us to analyze and to really understand the significance of what was lost. When the house of Romanov fell, basically the world rejoiced. The enemies of Russia rejoiced, and among them, the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, said that the world has become freer for democracy. Now, if we were to objectively look at history since 1917 and examine exactly what the program was for a better Russia and a better world, I think we would all conclude that what was done after the Romanovs left the ruling of Russia and their influence in the world, we can hardly think or even compare the deeds of the rulers after 1917 and up to our time, both in Russia and outside. So this gives us pause to think, instead of being, as we think we are, very enlightened in our criticisms of what was known as Holy Russia and the Romanov Dynasty, looking back and mournfully reflecting on what we have lost in terms of a noble and a pious view of life towards rulers, towards authority in general. The spirit of independence has now flooded the world, and it increases every day, and it's become infectious in all of us, and even in some of the churches. The idea that opinions, whether they're based on the gospel or not, somehow have a right to rule our lives and the rest of the world. You yourselves know as well as I do, or probably much better than I do, the struggle that Orthodox Christians are now subjected to in just preserving the very basics of our faith in what has become a rather hostile atmosphere. Nonetheless, we do and we can examine the legacy of the Romanov Dynasty, and if I think that we would step away from the very sort of negative attitude that the modern world has adopted towards that period and the periods previous, and try to examine the positive in those centuries and in the lives and the activities of those rulers, I think it might say something to us today, both in our daily individual lives, our family lives, and even in the lives of the church, our monastery, and our seminary. These are just some small, brief thoughts that crossed my mind since early this morning that I thought I would share with you. I now turn over the program to Father Vladimir, who has prepared the rest of the program for you, and I welcome you all to our memorial, might say, commemoration of the House of Romanov. Vladimir.
Dear fathers, dear seminarians, Matушka Elizaveta, dear guests. So Father Luke spoke with us several months ago about the possibility of somehow also hosting an event marking this anniversary. And it seemed only fitting to choose today's date because today, a year ago, our Synod of Bishops at their annual winter session in New York at the church's headquarters on 93rd Street and Park Avenue decreed that this year indeed should be marked by the church abroad also in prayer, in commemorations, and a number of events that the church planned to undertake. So when we think about how did the church really celebrate this event, or how did it remember it? First of all, of course, it was an event that was marked during each divine liturgy, at the dismissal, at the Outpost, when all year long, beginning with January, and it will continue up to the end of the year, at the end of December, the royal martyrs are commemorated and remembered along with Grand Duchess Elizaveta Fyodorovna as well, and Nun Barbara at the dismissal. In addition to that, there was a large-scale event in Toronto from September 5th through the 8th that also coincided with the fall session of the Synod and was attended by a larger number of bishops than usually appear at the Synod. A number of guests came also from Russia to attend this event. There were lectures, services, concert as well, and this was really the main event that was held on the East Coast. Aside from another gathering in the summer on June 18th, also which coincided with this time the summer session of the Holy Synod, when a festive celebration was held at the Synod of Bishops with also Panikhida, just as today. That was followed by a reception afterwards, which was attended also by some of the Russian diplomats, by dignitaries from other diplomatic representations, as well as bishops and clergy from other jurisdictions. In addition, the larger Russian community was present, as represented also by the Russian Nobility Association and some other charitable organizations. So when we were thinking about the fact that events were held both in Toronto, in New York. Of course, we also thought about what was it that actually locally here the seminary and the monastery did or wanted to do to remember this date, this anniversary, or maybe attempted to do. Well, we all know that a number of exhibits were held not only in this country, but certainly in Russia, numerous exhibits. One of the most famous ones probably was just held a month ago at the Manezhnaya Ploshchad in Moscow, which was organized actually by the cultural representation within the church headed by Archimandrite Tikhon Shevkunov, and it was extremely successful. But certainly there are also a number of things that both the seminary and the monastery, and what we like to think of also as our sort of resource center, our foundation here that oversees some of the cultural collections that Jordanville holds. There, even though it may not always have been evident here locally, but there were a number of events that were either supported or that we were able to participate in throughout this year. And to tell us a little bit about these events, I've asked our librarian and collections registrar, Mikhail Perekrestov, to prepare a little presentation on that and tell us more about that. After the end of this presentation, we will still have a little bit of a musical presentation, hopefully. I'm told that our choir director is ill, but there's hope that he will appear or has appeared. Will appear. All right. Well, we have, I think, somebody possibly filling in. So please, Michael, we look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Reverend Fathers, dear brothers and sisters, for decades, Holy Trinity Monastery and Seminary have served not only as a spiritual center of the Russian Orthodox Church abroad, but have also taken on an important role as a repository of historically and culturally important materials related to pre-revolutionary Russia and the Russian diaspora. In this way, Holy Trinity Monastery has continued the age-old tradition of other monasteries, which historically have been centers of learning in addition to their primary spiritual role. Over the years, a rich collection of library, archival, and museum materials have been collected here in Jordanville. Among these are a number of materials related to various members of the House of Romanov, the dynasty that ruled Russia from 1613 to 1917. Today, as we commemorate the members of this family, I'd like to tell you briefly about some of the Romanov-related materials held in our collections and how Holy Trinity Monastery and Seminary have participated in marking this anniversary through the activities of the library, archive, and museum. This is a brief overview of the areas that I will be covering in this talk. The first one is recent discoveries and new acquisitions. The second being exhibitions, conferences, and publications. And the third, efforts in restoration and preservation. First of all, I'd like to address the topic of recent discoveries in our library collections. Over the last 2 years, thanks to a grant that we received, we have been cataloging the monastery library, which used to be located on the second floor of the main monastery building and now has been relocated to the old print shop. In the process of cataloging these materials, we have discovered that a number of books were originally held in various imperial libraries. In this slide, you see examples of the book plates that show who the previous owners of these books were. As you can see in the slide on the left side, in the top left, is a book plate from Tsar Nicholas II's Winter Palace Library. In the center, there is the bookplate of Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich, the son of Emperor Alexander III. On the right, we see a book plate of the Tsarevich Alexei, son of Nicholas II. And on the bottom, along the bottom, there are several other book plates which are in the monastery library collection, which originally came from, somehow got here from the libraries of various Grand Dukes and Grand Duchesses. There are over 60 volumes have been discovered, so to speak, that are from these imperial collections. Among these books from the libraries of various Romanov family members are 27 volumes from the personal library of Grand Duke Konstantin Konstantinovich, whom you see in this portrait, which is also at our museum. He was the grandson of Nicholas I and was also a celebrated poet. There's no book plate in these books, but you can see on the bottom of the spine is his monogram surmounted by an imperial crown, and some of these books are on display in the tall case to my left. So the process of cataloging led to the identification of these books as being from imperial libraries, and interestingly, a lot of them were discovered this year, which seems to be more than a coincidence. This 3-volume set of Ухтомский из путешествия на Восток его императорского высочества государя-наследника Цесаревича, published in the years 1893 to 1897, is another example of Imperial Association volumes held in our collection. This work describes the travels of Nicholas II when he was the heir apparent. He visited various Asian countries, and these volumes are held in the museum. They've been there for several years, if not decades, but it was only this year that we discovered that the second volume of this work has the book plate of Emperor Nicholas II, which you see in the bottom right. So it's interesting that a work describing his travels, Emperor Nicholas's travels, is a book that was apparently in his library is now in our collection. In 2010, the Russian Nobility Association decided to transfer its archives and library to Jordanville. This is a unique collection with a large number of rare genealogical materials relating to various aristocratic Russian families. The Russian Nobility Association library was cataloged this year, and I should mention that the picture is showing the space where the library and archive are currently housed downstairs in a remodeled space of the library. So this year, most of the library was cataloged, and as with the monastery library collection, it was discovered that a number of volumes have stamps or book plates of various imperial libraries. In the case, in the display case behind the projector screen is an example of this. There's a volume with the stamp of one of the imperial libraries from Tsarskoye Selo. So this was an overview of the Romanov-related books in our collection that have come to light in the past year. As in the library, the process of cataloging objects in the museum have revealed some new information about objects that have been in the collection for some years. Some objects, like the autographed photographs of members of the imperial family, which are in that display case, were donated some years ago, but were not cataloged at the time. So it was a pleasant surprise for me personally to find these photographs which had been signed by members of the royal family. Along with others, this album was donated some time ago, but recent research has revealed that information about it, the initial information about it was not quite correct. It was assumed that this was an album showing the palace, the Anichkov Palace, which is where Alexander III and his family lived. But after doing some research this past year, we discovered that it's actually the palace of Grand Duke Pavel Alexandrovich. And this album shows 18 photographs of his palace. He was the brother of Alexander III, and Pavel Alexandrovich acquired it in 1887, lived there until 1891, and now, interestingly, it is in the possession of the oil giant Luke Oil and is being used by them. The museum collection contains not only objects that belonged to members of the royal family, but also objects that were gifted to them by various individuals. Again, recent research has revealed that these two icons, which you see on this slide, they've been in the collection for some time, but it's been, after doing some research, we've realized that these were presents from members of the royal family to various individuals. On the left is a small icon of the Mother of God of the Sign, of course quite appropriate today when we're commemorating the Kursk route icon. And this was presented by Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna to Elizaveta Vladimirovna Gyatsintova in 1916 for her efforts and labors in the hospital of the Ministry of Finance in Petrograd during World War I. On the right is a diptych of Saints Peter and Paul, and on the reverse is an inscription in Russian, to the Grenadier Sapper Battalion, a blessing from the chief, 1904. And initially we didn't really know who the chief or the chef was, but after some research we came on information that indicated that the chef of the battalion was Grand Duke Peter Nikolaevich, and that the icon was given to the battalion when the battalion was leaving for Manchuria during the Russo-Japanese War. Another example is a very, very interesting podriznik, priest's vestment, and the donor referred to it as a Velikopostny podriznik, one that's supposed to be worn on Great Lent. I think it's a little bit too colorful for that, but that's my personal opinion. It's also been in the collection since the 1990s, but a tag on the back on the inside of the podriznik indicates that it was gifted to someone or some church by the new martyr Grand Duchess Elizaveta Fyodorovna. So far, I've been speaking of the objects in the museum that have been in the collection for some time. At this time, I'd like to point out that almost all the objects on display here today have a direct connection to the Romanov family, except for the Nicholas, the first portrait and one of the photographs over there. But every single object we're more or less sure, held by one of the members of the royal family. I mean, we have autographed photographs, so obviously they had to be in the hands of that person for at least several seconds. They're items from the Ipatiev house. They're books from various imperial libraries. So these all have a very direct connection to members of the Romanov family. I'd like to transition to objects of imperial origin that have been recently added to the collection, that is, to recent acquisitions. And I will start with this glass, a glass goblet from the reign of Empress Elizaveta Petrovna, and it was recently donated to the museum by a member of the Dvorzhitsky family, and the goblet was presented to a Dvorzhitsky family member in the 1800s by Tsar Alexander II. Probably some of the most significant items of imperial provenance are objects that were found inside and in the vicinity of the Ipatiev house in Yekaterinburg, the site of the brutal murder of Tsar Nicholas II, his family, and 4 of their attendants by the Bolsheviks on the night of July 17, 1918. These objects were collected by Nikolai A. Sokolov, who was charged by the White Army to conduct the investigation of the murder. A number of pieces originally collected by Sokolov as material evidence, as well as one of the copies of his investigative report, which he wrote after this investigation, have ended up in Jordanville's museum and archives. Originally, all objects collected by Sokolov comprised 50 cases. However, after being shipped to England or en route somewhere, some of what had been discovered by Sokolov seems to have been lost. The collection was further fragmented as Nicholas II's sister, Ksenia Alexandrovna, donated some of these items to a Russian church in Brussels and some to other individuals. The items held here were donated by Ksenia Alexandrovna to Father Mikhail Polsky in 1948, a Russian priest who was serving in London at the time. After his passing in 1960, while being assigned to serve in San Francisco, these items were donated to Holy Trinity Monastery in Jordanville, in keeping with Father Mikhail's last will. In this slide, you see an icon of Christ on the left, which was presented to Grand Duchess Anastasia Nikolaevna by her parents on her 13th birthday. The documents from Sokolov's investigation held in our archives confirm that this icon was indeed found in Yekaterinburg at the Ipatiev house. A long list of items compiled during the investigations in Yekaterinburg by Sokolov lists under number 13, quote, large icon of Christ, image not made by hands, with a light brown border. Inscription on the back reads, Tsarskoye Selo, Anastasia, 1914, June 5th. The inscription is by Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna, end quote. In the center is the Tobolsk icon of the Mother of God, and the number 422 corresponds to a description in another list from also from the same investigative report. So once again, there's confirmation that these objects were indeed in the Ipatiev house. And on the right is the military jacket of Tsarevich Alexei. Some of you may remember these items because they've been on display at the museum and they've been here since the 1960s. They came along with a number of other objects, clothes hangers, plates, spools of knitting yarn, napkins, the Tsar Nicholas's military trousers. However, in 2010, another group of objects from the Ipatiev house resurfaced. They were donated to Jordanville by Archbishop Kirill of San Francisco. In addition to objects, this group contained hundreds of pages of documents, invoices, bills, correspondence, newspaper clippings, photographs, all from Tobolsk and Yekaterinburg, where the royal family was incarcerated. There is no doubt that these items, essentially relics, are also from the Ipatiev house. For instance, these major general's shoulder boards, which you see on the left, one is from the 1962 donation. The second is from the 2010 donation. So it's like pieces of a puzzle that fit together. So the items in the second group complement the items that were received back in the 1960s. So it's kind of amazing that these two shoulder boards are rejoined after 50 years or more of being apart. These shoulder boards were probably belonged to either General Tatishev or General Dolgoruki, who are shown in the photograph, which is also from the 2010 donation, both of whom were major generals. The 2010 group contained similar objects to the 1960 group: hangers, clothes hangers, articles of clothing, forks, a thermometer, a calendar, cufflinks, Dr. Botkin's denture. Some can be seen in this tall case. On the slide, you see a blouse that belonged to one of the, probably one of the daughters of Tsar Nicholas. And also on the right is the underskirt of Anastasia Nikolaevna. Her initials are embroidered on the inside, AN. Here's another example of the pieces of the puzzle fitting together. These cufflinks, when I was cataloging these objects, I was really puzzled by them because they have tags from Cuban cigars inside of them. And I failed to make any connection between Yekaterinburg, Siberia, the royal family, and Cuba. Didn't make sense. So I started digging around and doing some research. And also there's an inscription on the back. It says 27th of July, 1914. That was another piece that was puzzling. So I decided to look into the investigation report that we have in our archives, which contains lists of all of the items that were found in and around the Ipatiev house. And lo and behold, I found a description of these cufflinks. It turns out that they belonged to the personal physician of Tsar Nicholas and his family, Yevgeny Botkin, who was executed alongside the royal family. The date, 27th of July, 1914, which is engraved on the back, is probably in commemoration of Botkin's 25th anniversary of graduating from the Военно-медицинская академия, the military medical academy, in 1889. And July 27th, by the way, is the old style date of commemoration of Saint Panteleimon, the patron saint of doctors. So it would make sense that, you know, as a doctor, this date would be significant to Botkin. Engraved on the glass covering of the cigar labels are two signatures, Yura and Mima. And from the letters of Tatiana Botkina, the daughter of the physician, it becomes clear that she would refer to her brothers as Yura and Mima, short for Dimitri. And here you see Dr. Botkin with his daughter Tatiana and his youngest son, Gleb. Yet another example of how the various materials donated at different times support each other and confirm one another's authenticity. Along with the 2010 donation, we received the envelope which you see below. It had a handwritten inscription by Sokolov, which said, "The material evidence earring." Above is the black and white photograph from Sokolov's report when he photographed material evidence. So both the envelope and the black and white photograph are from Sokolov's report. According to witnesses, again referring to Sokolov's investigative report, this earring belonged to the Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna, and they were one of her favorites, and she would wear them a lot, as you can see from the photograph on the right, where she is no doubt wearing this earring. We thought that the contents of the envelope had been lost. But in February 2012, we found out that the earring was stored in a safe at the Synod of Bishops in New York all these years. And according to the decision of the Synod, the earring was transferred to our museum. And interesting enough, yet again, the pieces of the puzzle are fitting together, and the earring, which was contained in an envelope after decades of being apart, are rejoined here. So you may ask, what has been done with these precious materials? Is anyone able to see them? The answer is yes. I'm now turning to the second section of this presentation, namely exhibitions, conferences, and publications. This map shows the location of exhibitions, conferences, and conferences dedicated to the 400th anniversary of the Romanov family, where we have participated in one form or another. The locations are Minneapolis, Minnesota, New Orleans in Louisiana, Washington, D.C., New York, and Boston, and then on the right-hand side, Moscow and Yekaterinburg in Russia. In May 2012, in anticipation of this anniversary year, the State Archive of the Russian Federation, also known as GARF, in cooperation with us, organized an exhibit dedicated to the last days of Tsar Nicholas and his family, titled Death of Nicholas II and His Family, a Century-Long Investigation. The exhibit took place in Moscow. They really wanted us to participate because our collection has all of these unique items from the last days of the Romanov family, from the Ipatiev house, and no other museum in the world really has anything comparable to this. And I should also say that this is quite an achievement on the part of, it says Vladimir specifically, for having made this connection with the State Archive of the Russian Federation, which is really a government institution on the level of the National Archives here in Washington, D.C. So this photo, these photos are showing some of the objects from our collection as they were exhibited at this exhibit in Moscow. Metropolitan Hilarion participated in the official opening ceremonies of this exhibit. This exhibit had about 7,500 visitors. And it seems to have had quite a profound effect on people who came and saw these objects. I spoke to an acquaintance of mine who visited this exhibition. She is a curator. She has organized multiple exhibits dedicated to the royal family and has visited countless similar exhibits. And she said, "I was deeply touched by this exhibit. This is the first exhibit that I've been to where there were so many young people and everyone was viewing the exhibit in total silence." So we know that these objects are essentially relics. Maybe visitors, not all visitors understand this, but these objects certainly have a power that makes an impression on visitors, perhaps on a subconscious level. Hopefully, this has a positive effect on the way that Russian people view the last Tsar and his family. In July of 2013, the same exhibit traveled to Yekaterinburg, the place where the last imperial family was murdered. And for the first time, these objects came back to the place where they were originally found by Sokolov. Our church was represented by Bishop Agapit from Germany at the opening. And I should also mention that a catalog was published both for the State Archive exhibition and again re-released for the Ekaterinburg exhibition, which features an article by Father Vladimir about the objects in our collection. So moving to the US, in February 2013, the Hillwood Museum and Gardens, located in Washington, D.C., opened an exhibit titled Pageant of the Tsars, which featured coronation albums of the various Romanov emperors and empresses. We loaned 2 objects for this exhibit, a chromolithograph of Tsar Nicholas II crowning himself on the left. This was a donation by Princess Vera Konstantinovna, the daughter of Konstantin Konstantinovich, whom I referred to earlier. And on the right is a epitrachil that was part of the coronation set of vestments that was worn at the coronation of Nicholas and Alexandra in 1896. This exhibit had 17,474 visitors. In June 2013, going back to Moscow, there was an exhibit titled Romanovi штрихи к биографии из Музейно-архивного собрания Дома русского зарубежья, which featured albums, photographs, and some objects from the collections of the Dom Русского зарубежья, the House of the Russian Diaspora, which is located in Moscow. Our contribution to this exhibit was a gift of duplicates from the Jordanville publications about the Romanovs, some of which were featured in this exhibit. Going back to the US. Last year, the Museum of Russian Art in Minneapolis, Minnesota, approached us with a request to borrow some materials from our collection for their upcoming exhibit, Romanov's Legacy of an Empire Lost. We ended up sending over 160 objects for this exhibit, which makes up roughly 3/4 of all the items exhibited here. And I should mention that most of these objects in the photo that you see here are from our collection. The exhibit was curated by Maria Zavyalova, a Russian Orthodox woman who's a parishioner of our church in Minneapolis, and consequently it's done with great respect and understanding of Russian history and of the Romanov Dynasty that unfortunately is lacking often in academic discourse in the US, as Father Luke mentioned in his comments. This gallery is dedicated to the last days of Nicholas II and his family, and it consists exclusively of objects from our collection. As in Russia, these objects make a profound impression on visitors, and I was fortunate enough to attend the opening of this exhibit, which took place in the middle of November. And of course, the opening ceremonies are, I didn't have a chance to really look at all of the objects carefully. So the following day I came, this was the first day that the exhibit was open to the general public. And I was struck by, first of all, the number of visitors who came, and secondly, by the positive comments that that the exhibit elicited. And it seemed to me that people were rethinking their attitude towards Russia, towards Russian history, and towards the Romanov family, which I think is exactly what these kinds of exhibits should do. Our participation to this exhibit certainly contributes to this fact. I'm going to go back to this slide. If you would turn your attention to the left top corner, you can see some icons. And as a matter of fact, those are life-size reproductions of some of the icons of the royal martyrs that it's Father Leonid in our icon mounting studio produced specifically for this exhibition. And there's a life-size reproduction of the large icon of the new martyrs, which is hanging in the lower church of St. Job of Pachayev. So in effect, the fact that this exhibition ends with the canonization of the Romanov family is something that's unheard of, especially here in the US. And in effect, this is a form of subtle missionary work, I would say, on our part. So the notion of bloody Nicholas, the weak-willed tyrant, which is really contradictory, I think, is being challenged here by the way that things are presented and the way that the Romanov family is presented here. The exhibit is quite popular and successful so far. It has glowing reviews in local media. In the first 10 days, 1,872 people visited the exhibit. And on a single day, the Friday after Thanksgiving, more than 800 people came and visited this exhibit. So it's definitely breaking attendance records. So I will end this section with an overview of conferences where Father Vladimir has represented the Foundation of Russian History and Holy Trinity Monastery and Seminary. Just briefly, the first conference took place in New Orleans in Louisiana. It was titled The House of Special Purpose and the Fate of Sokolov's Material Evidence. It was part of a roundtable titled 400 Years of the House of Romanov, New Archival Discoveries. The second conference took place in Colombia in February of this year, and title was New Discoveries of Russian Imperial Materials in Exile. And the third one took place in Moscow, Romanovskaya коллекция в диаспоре, the Romanov collections in the diaspora, and took place in the Dom Russkoого Зарубежья, the House of Russian Diaspora, in June of 2013. I attended the conference at Columbia, and again, I heard some very positive feedback. One of the attendees, who is an Orthodox person who has great respect for the royal family, but also is a scholar and a regular attendee of such academic conferences, remarked on the changes in attitude towards the Romanovs. It's less harsh, a little bit more understanding, which is unusual for these types of conferences and up to this point. So it's quite, I think it's a wonderful change that's taking place. And I would like to think that our participation in this discourse is contributing to a better understanding of the Romanovs and a reevaluation of all the negative things that have been said about them. Also briefly, the conference was, there was a reporter for the New York Times at the conference, and she wrote a very positive article about mentioning the monastery in our collection, and specifically the earring of Alexandra Fyodorovna, which was donated at that time. Lastly, I'd like to briefly speak about the efforts in preservation and restoration over the last year, specifically as they apply to Romanov-related objects in our collection. Here you see lithographs that were donated by Vera Konstantinovna, the Grand Duchess, daughter of Konstantin Konstantinovich. Unfortunately, at some point, they were mounted on acidic cardboard. There were tears, there were losses, and 5 of these lithographs, including the one that was displayed at the Hillwood Museum, were conserved this year. One of the benefits of lending works to other museums is that the borrowing museum will oftentimes take on the expense of conservation. So this is a side effect of lending to exhibitions. So that's quite wonderful for us. Here you see the portrait of Nicholas I, which has losses of paint, scratches, even a hole in the canvas, which you can see in the top right, and a terrible yellowing of the varnish. And I invite all of you after the presentation to come take a look closely at this photograph, and then look at the end result, which is hanging right behind the screen. And the restorer, of course, has done an amazing job. As I was hanging up the painting, I was trying to figure out where the hole used to be, but there was no way that I could tell. This is the St. George standard of His Imperial Majesty's own convoy, which is displayed in this long case. Essentially, the convoy was the Tsar's bodyguard, the bodyguards taken from the best Cossacks serving in the army. We have 3 of the banners that belonged to this military unit. And the one shown here was presented by Alexander II on August 30th, 1856. So these are quite unique relics, so to speak, that, you know, they're not duplicated anywhere else in the world, and there's a certain responsibility that we have in making sure that they're preserved. And currently, we're planning to restore them and actively coordinating with a donor who is willing to provide funds for their restoration. So in conclusion, this was an overview of the ways in which the monastery has contributed to the celebration of the Romanovs' 400th anniversary through the library, archival, and museum collections held here in Jordanville. Because our resources are limited, we are still working on opening a redesigned exhibit here, and Mrs. Vladimir will speak briefly about that. However, this has not prevented these objects from being seen by the public. Through our collaboration with various institutions, thousands of people have had a chance to view these precious objects, both in Russia and the United States. This is a significant, if subtle, way that the monastery has contributed to a better understanding of the role and contribution of the Romanov Dynasty, and specifically in battling the prejudiced views on the Tsar martyr Nicholas and his family that are unfortunately so widespread both in Russia and the US, which is exactly what Father Luke was mentioning. Through presenting the truth about the last Tsar at exhibitions and conferences, we are challenging the persistent slanderous propaganda leveled at the royal family, both in the former Soviet Union as well as here in the West, unfortunately. It is not by chance that these precious objects have ended up here in the monastery. Surely we have a certain degree of responsibility to use them as a means, if at all possible, to bring people closer to God. It is our sincere hope that our activity will have a positive effect on the souls of the people who come to these exhibitions and conferences. We are grateful for the opportunity to carry on this, shall we say, covert missionary work outside the walls of the monastery. Through the prayers of the Mother of God and the royal martyrs, we ask that God will guide our steps in the constructive use of these resources for the benefit of others and for the glory of His holy name. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for this very informative talk and presentation. And I think it also speaks very well to what it is that we actually do behind those doors that always seem to be closed and where nobody has access to. I think that few probably know the kind of collections that are housed not only behind those doors, but even in one of the classrooms upstairs and in the archives. And now we have part of the library, as Michael has mentioned, in a repurposed space that used to serve as part of the print shop. But I think this was also a good example of what our kind of resource center or research center actually, what kind of activities it undertakes. As some of you may know, we have a foundation that was originally founded by Metropolitan Loris when he was still Archbishop Loris in, I think it was 1988, that was precisely intended to serve as a sort of custodian for these research collections. And HTOS Rector has just asked me again, which he's done many times, when will the museum finally be open? So of course today we only have a small selection of materials that are prepared for you to look at, and mostly things that were actually mentioned today that have to do, for example, with some of the preservation efforts that have been undertaken this year. So of course it's only a very small number. But as Michael has also mentioned, there are great challenges when it comes to the restoration, the preservation, some damages that have occurred, of course, over time due to either acidic enclosures or the lack at times of proper humidity controls and things of that nature. And we've been working for the past probably 2 years to get to the point where we can actually open up a new exhibit. And we will indeed be able to, with God's help, hopefully, to do so this year. And the date that has been set for the opening of the museum is May 25th, the day of graduation, seminary graduation as well. However, it's intended not just as the opening of an exhibit or the opening of a museum, rather the exhibit is intended to mark actually a sort of rededication of the foundation's role as a resource center, as a custodian of these cultural collections. The exhibit will attempt to include items from all of the different collections that the museum, the archives, and the library currently holds. And the sort of working title that we've arrived at will be 500 Years of Russian History Through Print and Book Culture. So it will feature all sorts of different media and will be based on certainly manuscripts, print materials, but will of course include three-dimensional objects from the museum as well as some items from our archives as well. So May 25th, hopefully you will all be able to view this new exhibit that we hope to open up then. And now I see that our choir director is feeling better and is finally here. So let me introduce all of you, to all of you, of course, Nikolai Kotter, whom you know very well, and here on a regular basis. Пожалуйста, наш семинарский хор.